Hello, and welcome to another episode of All the Things. I am Monique Duson.
And I am Krista Bontrager, and this is the show where we discuss all the things
Related to God, the Bible, and real life. Welcome to Saturday, y'all. Hey, I want to start out at the top with our new Center for Biblical Unity shirt. It says, "Ad hominem attacks don't change facts." You can get this shirt, the truth of this message, by going to centerforbiblicalunity.com and clicking on our merch section. It is there for all of you. Let the world know. Like, you can say what you want, but truth is truth. Yeah. How you been?
So I was inspired by a recent little mini viral video you had.
Yes.
It was a request, so I had to get on the stick and get the shirt made.
Well, there were a couple people in the comments who actually said, I had no idea. I don't even think that in the moment I realized that I had even said it. I was just talking. And someone was like, that should be a shirt. Someone actually made a template of another shirt. And I was like, that's so cool. But we already have ours. And
okay.
Yeah, I'm going to stay.
All right.
Right there.
We want to thank our moderators for helping us out in the chat tonight and keeping things peaceful, because some people's chats can be crazy. But here at the Center for Biblical Unity, we try to keep things peaceful and helpful, and they are there to help you. And we do want to encourage you to stay tuned for a very important announcement about where Monique and I will be speaking in the month of November. So stay tuned for that. Well, I'm pretty excited about tonight's guest. This is a topic that I've been wanting to do for a while. Our friend Kevin Briggens got us connected with our guest.
Okay, tonight we're going to be speaking with Will Spencer on his experience in the Manosphere, or what some are calling the new right. We've received several inquiries from moms, especially, who are concerned that their sons are seeking out wisdom from people like Andrew Tate.
So we are excited to welcome Will Spencer to All the Things. Welcome, Will.
Thanks so much for having me.
Hello. Well, we are glad that you are here. I think that you have a ton of information to offer our audience. Many of them probably actually saw you on Kevin and Devin. We call them the twins.
Kevin,
their podcast. But tell us a little bit just about who you are. Introduce yourself to our audience, and then make sure to tell us, how did you become involved in this, what we'll call, I guess, new right way of thinking? What drew you in and kept you there? And eventually, I would like to get to what actually made you leave.
Mm-hmm. So my name is Will Spencer. I'm the host of the Will Spencer podcast. You can find out more about me by visiting willspencer.co. So we can start there. I think the best way to set up my experience is that I didn't grow up in a Christian household. And I had a 20-year journey, more really, through various forms of New Age spirituality, occult spirituality, and also into this world of masculine personal development, which some people know as the Manosphere or the men's movement. And so through both of those paths, which were sort of happening in parallel, I got exposed to a bunch of different ideas about history, about the world, about men, women, masculinity, the recent past, in terms of the 20th century and all of that. And so having journeyed through both those worlds, I then came into the Christian church in 2020 and through 2020 and 2022, experiencing sanctification, discovering the reform world. And like many young men, I came in carrying these ideas that I'd been exposed to, and I never had them confronted in a biblical kind of sense. And so when those beliefs surfaced on my podcast, or those ideas surfaced on my podcast, I got corrected very hard and got shown the biblical truth of reality and changed my ways, repented and shifted. And then I documented, this is sort of a large setup for some of the specific questions that we'll get into. I sort of documented my journey in a couple of articles, one of them particularly being on the website Christ Over All, and sort of laying out the worldview that I had been exposed to. I didn't 100% share it, but it was something I just kind of took for granted that a lot of other young men carry. And so I've been talking about my experiences ever since in those regards, and apparently it's definitely touched a nerve.
I'm glad that you brought up the term, the manosphere. That might be something that's new to people. Other people might not have ever heard of that term. It's kind of in the online world. Sometimes it's called the red pill community. And I think that one of my struggles, I've been seeing this activity for a number of years on X, but I struggle with, well, how much is the online world in the real world? And do we want to bring this onto our podcast? Because some of the themes of the Manosphere can get very dark.
Mm.
And I don't know what the average mom needs to know about this. And that's been part of my struggle and tension of real world versus online world. But now, as sons are getting older and getting exposed to these ideas, I think it's important for people to be aware of that. Have you noticed that tension?
Yeah. Mom and, moms do need to know about this. Absolutely. With 100% without a doubt, they need to know about it. And also, moms need to recognize the role that they may have played in it as well. And so that's probably something that's worth talking about, because we're dealing with a generational crisis of fatherlessness that goes back to the mid 20th century. We're now at least 3 generations, possibly 4 generations in of American and Western society that has not only displaced the role of the father, but despised him. And as a result, you have generations, we had generations of girls growing up without fathers. And of course, that caused a certain set of societal problems. But we've also had successive generations of boys growing up without fathers. And boys who grow up without fathers don't just suddenly lack the need for fathers. They go looking for fathers from substitute sources. And they find it now, especially through the devices in their pockets. And the men who they encounter through devices in their pockets do not have these young men's best interests at heart, because they're not their fathers. They're influencers. They make often significant sums of money through men's attention, through weaponizing their bitterness and anger. And now they're fashioning these young men into a political weapon. The reason why many of these young men lack fathers is because of their mothers. And so that may not be true for every situation, but certainly it's true for many of them. And so I think part of this is a societal reckoning of not just the lacking role of the father, but also the way that mothers have played into that.
Ooh, you better go ahead. Okay, so let me go ahead and ask this question.
Yeah.
And so what I hear you saying, the theory that you're postulating is that the manosphere and this red pill community is largely men who are looking to get perhaps a need met, or that there is something potentially missing in the conversation of what it means to be a man. And in finding perhaps masculinity or some version of masculinity in someone like Tate, or I'm forgetting some of the other guy's name now, but there's something appealing that actually draws to them, and that a lot of this could possibly or does stem from the fact that we have so many young men who are growing up without fathers in their home.
Correct. Yes. So the reason why young men look to Andrew Tate, and just to be clear, Andrew Tate is a relatively recent phenomenon. The men's movement actually began in the mid 1980s. There's a book by the author Robert Bly called Iron John. Not a Christian book. It's actually deeply pagan. But by the mid 1980s, as baby boomers were entering their, I think it was their early 30s, something like that, or 40s, they were starting to become fathers themselves. There was a need that began to arise where a lot of these young men, and they were still young at the time, recognized they hadn't had connections with their fathers. And so they started looking for what it means to be a man. And that's where the men's movement came from. It began in the mid 1980s. So that proceeded for 40 years. Until it was Andrew Tate who actually was the one who was able to broach the mainstream and sort of take all the air out of the room for many different reasons. So he wasn't the end product. He was just the apex predator who came and, it's almost like Jordan Peterson, who I think did his very best with a very difficult situation. It's like Jordan Peterson validated this great need. That's why he had to be destroyed, is that he was speaking into a lot of young men's hunger for the father image. So here's Jordan Peterson. He's put together, he's articulate, he's intelligent. He looks like, it's like all these young men suddenly are like, Dad? right? They had never
Mm-hmm.
seen something like that before. And then Andrew Tate comes, and of course, 2020 happens, and then Jordan Peterson has some of his own struggles, and then Andrew Tate comes in and sort of capitalizes on this validated market. So Andrew Tate didn't create the phenomenon; he just exploited it the most successfully and the most ruthlessly. And I think that's really important. So what you're actually looking at when you see Andrew Tate is you see someone who has preyed upon 40 years of genuinely longing male hearts to understand what it means to be a father or what it means to have a father.
So then help me understand this, because the gentleman that you mentioned, like in the 80s, he said he was a pagan. Andrew Tate is a pagan.
Yeah.
Jordan Peterson is not a Christian. And when I say pagan, like he's not the person I want discipling my kid.
No.
You know what I mean?
No,
and so with that, it makes me wonder, well, why am I seeing this in the church? Hasn't the church had a position of, hey, our fathers are here, we're going to raise up and disciple our sons? Or are you bringing the church in and clumping the church in that regard too and saying, you know what, we missed the mark on this too?
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. The American evangelical church in some ways quit the hardest on fathers and marriage and church discipline and the gospel and the truth as preached in the Old and New Testaments. The place that should have been a bulwark against all of this completely quit. Not everywhere. There were certainly, again, I only became a Christian very recently, so some of this past I'm working to reconstruct in my own understanding.
Mm-hmm.
Of course, there were some faithful ministers and communities that stood up against the tide of father hatred in many ways, and they were called fundamentalists and got shamed pretty heavily. Many of those leaders had their own moral failings, I understand, and many churches just started to kind of shave off the edges of marriage and family and fatherhood and motherhood and all of this, sort of going with the spirit of the times. So what should have been the moral backbone of the United States gave up pretty hard. And into that vacuum, again, once you have the internet, into that vacuum steps truly pagan men. Of course, there are some I would say more immoral pagan men like Andrew Tate. And then I think Jordan Peterson genuinely tries to be a moral man, but from flawed Jungian foundations. But it was into that space that the failure of the American evangelical church, the American Christian church, really allowed other men to come in and try and address a need, some better than others, but the need was still there.
So tell us a little more specifically of what you think draws young men into this. I mean, part of it is, as I'm hearing, kind of an alienation from their fathers, but what is the real longing? What is it that's attractive to young men in following people, influencers in the manosphere?
Sure. I usually break it down along 3 lines: purpose, meaning, and belonging. So a lot of young men, if you talk to them today, will say, I don't know what my life purpose is. They're looking for some deeper reason to exist beyond just, making money. They don't understand what their purpose is. Sometimes that can mean a higher calling, like a vocation. Sometimes it can mean like, hey, this everyday existence just isn't doing it for me, and I need something higher to guide me. Meaning is men want to understand the meaning of the events of their lives, whether it be painful things they experienced in childhood or the difficult moral circumstances we find ourselves in this particular moment in history. We don't have difficult material circumstances. We have more material abundance than I think any other time in human history, but there's a definite lack of social cohesion, a definite lack of moral cohesion that causes a lot of pain in a lot of men and women around that. So what are the meaning of the events of our lives collectively and my life personally? And finally, and I think the most important thing, is a sense of belonging. I want to know that I'm not on my own anymore, that I'm not just a guy with a screen, that as a man, I'm part of a team, that we're going to take the hill, that we're together engaged in some sort of valuable collective effort that we're all committed to. We're committed to each other, and we're committed to the goal. That's a sense of male belonging. So men, the seductive power of this is purpose, meaning, and belonging. All of this was once provided by families and by churches, but that has long since gone. So men now find it online.
So let's go back to your first provocative statement about how mothers have contributed to this. Are you referring more specifically to those kinds of mothers who intentionally have children out of wedlock without fathers? Are you referring to the rise of no-fault divorce rates? Like, what is it specifically that you see how mothers might create a vulnerability in their sons to chase after these kinds of influencers?
Yeah, both of those, absolutely. The sexual revolution has legitimized and in many ways even celebrated premarital sex, and one of the consequences of premarital sex is children. And so if you sleep with a man outside of marriage, a man that if you as a woman sleep with a man that you have no intention of marrying and wouldn't marry and who you know would not be good marriage material, and if you sleep with him and a child results, you've now created a dad-deprived child. You have created that. So that is something that I think, if we're talking about a Christian podcast, needs to be repented of before God. I don't think there's any way you could say otherwise. Multiple things, in fact. I think the other component of this is no-fault divorce. God hates divorce. There are legitimate circumstances for divorce, and I think that there's probably another conversation to be had about what those look like. And certainly, being dead in the covenant, meaning creating an unsafe household, not loving, being abusive, things like that, I think are legitimate causes for divorce. Again, that's a separate conversation. But with no-fault divorce, beginning in the 1970s, which Ronald Reagan called his greatest mistake as a politician, women can end marriages, and they do, because they no longer find marriage fulfilling. And in most cases, in most states, custody goes to the woman. That's just the law. It doesn't matter whether she's been the one who's negligent or abusive. She will, in most cases, get custody of the children. Congratulations, you've just created another set of fatherless kids. In fact, there's Dad Talk Today with Eric Carroll. He has a very successful podcast speaking about these issues of men that have gone through no-fault divorce situations where their former wife has lied about them, and now they no longer get to see their kids. That's very common in America today. That creates dad-deprived situations. But another situation that I think is less talked about is a situation where the woman won't let her husband lead the household. Maybe she, where she makes him submit to her in various subtle and not so subtle ways. And so if you refuse to submit to your husband, if you refuse to respect your husband, is probably a better way of putting it. A man won't simply fight for respect in his household. A man will, if he loves his wife and loves his kids, he will quit and sacrifice himself for the integrity of his family. And so many men will go through their lives and go through their marriages being half the man that they could be because they simply don't want to come into conflict with their wife. They'll bottle up a lot of anger to protect their families from themselves. And so I think with all three of those cases, whether it be single motherhood, no-fault divorce, or simply henpecked and nagged husbands, which I should add is a category in Scripture. Better to live on the corner of the roof of a house than in a home with a contentious wife. Contentious women is a scriptural category. And so I think those situations are devastating, particularly inside the church, for creating fatherless homes, because the father isn't able to fill the house with his presence, because when he does, he comes into conflict with his wife. He doesn't wish to do that. He doesn't want to create conflict in front of the kids. So he surrenders and parents his children around the margins. I see a lot of that as well.
I hope you're enjoying this great conversation with our friend Will Spencer. That he has so much information to share with us. But we're going to take a quick time out and hear from our friends at Maven, because Monique and I will be speaking next month in November in Indianapolis. Let's check it out.
Truth and courage. Christians need a good dose of both in this current cultural moment. That's why you need to be at the 2025 Maven Conference. We are going to look at the anti-Christian culture that we're currently in and the unique challenges that it presents to us. The challenges of expressive individualism, the authority of the self, and how that dominates so much of our society. And then also critical theory, the ideas that permeate every institution. And families and students need to figure out how to navigate those challenges. So join us in Indianapolis on Saturday, November the 8th, where you'll get a good dose of both truth and courage to help you navigate this challenging world. Go to mavenconferences.com to register.
Once again, you can go to mavenconferences.com to find out more about the event where we will be speaking with our friends Neil Shenvi and Thaddeus Williams and others. Just go to mavenconferences.com. Okay, so we've talked about a few secular voices who are influencers and having this kind of messaging for young men. Who do you see on the Christian side that is reaching these young men? Like, I'm thinking about even 10, 15 years ago, someone like Mark Driscoll, who was really speaking to a lot of young men and trying to encourage them to get jobs, get married. I don't think I'm kind of seeing some things that Mark Driscoll said back then in a little bit of a new light, based on this conversation. But yeah. I mean, who are some people in the Christian space that you feel like are speaking to these young men in either in a healthy way or not a healthy way? Like, but they're definitely trying to speak into these issues.
Yeah, there's a spectrum. There's a spectrum of men that are doing it in a more healthy way and men that are doing it in a less healthy way. I'll focus on the men that I think are doing it in a more healthy way. I think Michael Foster does an excellent job of speaking to men in a healthy way. I think Vodi Bakum did a wonderful job, and Lord rest his soul. I'm so grateful for him and for his ministry, for the impact that he had on me. I think he did a fantastic job. And I think between those, there's really good leadership coming about, where if you're going to talk to men about how to lead a righteous life, you have to speak about it from a frame of responsibility. I think you can't just be berating a man to say, stand up, do better, quit porn, go to the gym. All those things are good and true and right, and they need to be said. But what really speaks to a man's heart is the notion of taking on righteous responsibility. And responsibility extends not just in front of us, but also side to side and behind us, which is to say, there are people that we want to be responsible with, and there are people that we want to be responsible for, and we want people to be responsible for us. Men aren't meant to live. It is not good for man to be alone. That doesn't just mean we need wives, though that is also true. It means a man isolated is easily picked off. And so men long to be in a community of responsible men. And so when I think about influencers who are speaking about men in the best possible way, they're inviting men to be part of healthy communities with a long-term perspective on legacy and future. Not just you have to take care of the tasks right in front of you. Yes, that's true, and you do, but who are giving men a broader perspective of what could be ahead of them and a broader perspective of who's standing beside them.
I kind of want to talk also about, like, who do you see in the Christian space that you think is going too far or is not speaking on these issues in a biblically faithful way? Like, is that something that you could give us some insight into?
Yeah, so I can give you one example. There's
or even if you don't want to name names, just tell me, like, what to look for. Like, what are the characteristics of what to, how to know when there's red flags?
Or you can send me a little note and I'll say the name.
Okay. I'll just send it to you on here on Zoom. No, I think for men, bitterness is a leading indicator for something going wrong in his heart. Like if you and bitterness is something in both men or women, but we're talking about men. Bitterness is something that surfaces very quickly. When you're listening to a friend, we all know when we're listening to a friend or a loved one, when they're just like venting because they need to let it out, versus when something comes out that has a different flavor of bitterness. We know that in ourselves as well. And so in men, once that flavor of bitterness comes out, that is always a leading indicator that they're heading in the wrong direction. A good example for contrast is World War I was the most brutal war ever fought in human history, more so even than World War II. Men were living in trenches in Europe for months at a time under intense bombardment, gas, and machine gun fire. I mean, it was legitimately awful. And so when you think about men who had to endure situations like that versus the situations that men have to endure today, or what Christ endured on the cross without bitterness, I think we can set ourselves as humans in perspective and say, yeah, maybe things are kind of going okay for me and I should let off the root of bitterness a bit. So once men start getting this root of bitterness in them, however, it becomes very easy for them to be manipulated by anger, for them to be manipulated with their passions. And a lot of young men, because of fatherlessness, have gotten themselves into pretty serious situations with apathy and inaction, with idleness, whether it be through porn addiction, video games, lack of ambition in their careers, social anxiety. A bunch of different things have come as a result of that have just like become anchors that sink men down. And so a man who's in that position will often begin getting bitter about his situation, and then you can use anger to bolt him up out of the ditch. And that will work. Like a man who gets very angry about his circumstances as a result of his own choices will actually get out of the ditch with anger.
Yep.
The problem is that anger will drive you very quickly into the next ditch.
Mm-hmm.
Right? You have to let it go. It can be a useful fuel for a brief period of time to get you off the launch pad, but if you continue using it as a fuel, it will end up being destructive versus like having to stay on the straight and narrow. So when considering influencers to let your sons be exposed to or to explore, be very sensitive to how the words that they're saying are making you feel. If you're starting to feel angry as a result of the words that they're using, if you're starting to feel angry because of their framing or just their general vibe of whatever the content is, podcast, YouTube video, or whatever, be very mindful of that and listen to more and see if that feeling persists. If it does, that's probably not going to end up being a good influence long term. I don't mean to discount the value of anger entirely. Mm-hmm. There is cause for saying, young men, you have to shape up or ship out, if we don't mind putting things in a mid-century way, where it's like you're meant to inspire the anger. You're meant to poke at him to make him feel a little guilty and maybe even a little ashamed so that he responds with some energy to address the situation. But it can't stay that way. You have to be guided by the North Star of righteousness, not anger. Otherwise, you're not going to get anywhere. So be sensitive to what you feel in the content that's coming that you want to expose your kids to, and listen to a lot of it. And if there's a little bit of anger here, but overall it's generally towards righteousness, that's fine. That's a more balanced perspective. But if it's 24/7 anger, bitterness, blaming all the time, stay far away.
That's helpful to, for parents to think about, for moms to think about. I'm wondering if, some of this bitterness that has led to this launch pad of anger that has now, gotten many kids or young men in the next ditch is due in part to like a couple of decades of DEI policies that seem to have rigged the system against white men.
Yeah. I mean, I think that's a fair assessment. And I know that it's real. There have been many books that have been written about it. Vodi Bakum's Fault Lines, Jeremy Carl's The Unprotected Class is a newer one. I can think of a bunch of others. And I think it's fair to look at the way that much of American society has been rigged unfairly against white men in particular. Mm-hmm. I'll give you a good example. Like I was applying to university. This is in the mid 1990s. I was applying to college, 1995. And I applied to Stanford University, and I was like, I just applied just to see. I was like, there's no way that a white kid from Phoenix is going to get into Stanford University. And I was already thinking that 30 years ago, right? Mm-hmm. Praise God, I did get in, which was, my family was all very happy about that. And so was I. But you can see how these ideas are quite a bit older. Like if I, as a 17-year-old kid in 1995, was thinking that way, and people have become aware of wokeness just in the past decade or so, mm-hmm. It's actually much older than that. So I think it's fair to say that, but we have to always be mindful as Christians in particular, what our response is to unjust circumstances. Mm-hmm. My pastor, wonderful man, he says, anger is a response to a perceived injustice. When we perceive injustice, we feel angry in response. It's a natural human response. Jesus was angry, Paul got angry, anger is all throughout Scripture. But the question is then, what do we do with that?
Mhm.
If we use our anger to make us bitter, or if we use our anger to make us violent, if only in words, if we use our anger as an excuse to persecute other people, first of all, we're sinning. But second of all, we're missing the opportunity for sanctification and understanding Christ's character, because it was absolutely an injustice that Christ himself was crucified, the greatest injustice in history. And yet he still submitted to that joyfully as God's will. And we find freedom, as hard as this is to understand for the average man, probably the average woman too, but as hard as it is to understand for the average man, only in submitting to God's will do we find freedom. It is God's will that these be the set of circumstances that we face right now. That does not mean that they should be allowed to remain. That doesn't mean that they're just. That doesn't mean that we should just passively accept them. But there's a freedom and understanding, for whatever reason, this is God's will for right now in this moment. And can I submit to them, find freedom in them within myself, and then work to overcome them, as opposed to raising my fist, taking out the sword, saying, this is unjust, and I'm going charging into battle. I don't think that's the right way to approach it. I think that's a way that men drive themselves into a ditch very quickly. But as Christians, we're called to take a different path. And so that's what I try to encourage men towards. It's a difficult balance, because I don't mean to say be passive. I don't mean to say be passive in the face of injustice. I don't think the Christian life calls us to that either. But we're called to the right sort of action from the right place within ourselves.
Yeah.
That's what God cares about.
Some terms that I've heard that I would love for you to maybe explain when I hear these conversations. One is the longhouse. I don't really know what that means. Now, I could Google it, of course, but I think it would be helpful to hear you explain what the longhouse is and how the role that plays in some of these dynamics for young men, and also the idea of trash world. That's another term that I hear a lot online. So I don't know if you can maybe help us decode those terms a bit.
Mm-hmm. The longhouse describes a society that's driven by female sensibilities versus men's sensibilities. And the idea that men being men transgresses the female sensibilities, and so men have to be bashed back into line, shamed back into line, punished back into line, along with female sensibilities. So that's the longhouse. That when a man stands up and he's confident and he sits upright, then he's called a man spreading. And when a man tries to explain something to a woman from a position of just really wanting to, it's called mansplaining. It's implied that he's condescending. White, cis-normal, patriarchal oppression, the idea that civilization itself is by nature oppressive. It's like Rousseau in some sense. So the longhouse says every male standard has to be destroyed so that men have to live in women's world rather than women living in a man's world. And so that describes our society today. And you don't have to take my word for it. You can look up Helen Andrews, NatCon 2025. She gave a talk, I think it was about a month ago at a conference. I was there to listen, just a short talk, 10, 15 minutes. And she explains something that I've observed for a long time is the feminine renorming of society, that men have to, in a sense, submit to female social norms of inclusion, acceptance, everybody get along, no one has hurt feelings, versus male norms of justice, truth, respectful confrontation. All of those are out in exchange for everyone needs to feel the same way about everything, which is more a feminine social norm. So that's the longhouse. Trash world sort of describes the way that since the mid 20th century, but really it's more recent, everything that used to be durable and reliable and worthwhile has decayed into plastic disposable trash. Not just the things that we buy every day, appliances, cars, etc., household goods, but also things like family has become kind of disposable. Things like social relationships, friendships have become very fake and superficial. And our media, the movies, TV shows, literature, books, all of it has become very, very shallow, very disposable, meant to be consumed for a moment and just thrown away. We have a consumer culture, not just in our goods, but also in our cultural products. So Trash World kind of explains how shallow and superficial everything feels, that it's lacking heart and substance and depth and just meant to be thrown away for the next thing. So that's the longhouse and trash world.
I can see how that would, if I saw the world through that lens of, that the world has been rigged for women, it has been rigged for people. If I was just a normal white guy feeling like the world was rigged against me, I can see how that would kind of lead to a mindset and posture of depression, discouragement.
Yeah.
I don't know if desperation's too strong of a word, but then also feeling like maybe even their culture is being trashed or erased.
Mhm.
Is that part of the dynamic? Because some of that might seem a little legitimate to me, those concerns.
Absolutely. Let's take the perspective of a young man. We'll call him. He's 26 years old today. So he's born in 1999. Doesn't remember 9/11. Yeah, born in 1999. So let's say he grew up in a single mother household through divorce. Let's just say through divorce. His parents divorced when he was very young. Grew up in a split household, primarily raised by his mother. He went to grade school, middle school, and high school, which the public school is largely dominated by female teachers, not to mention like daycare and stuff like that. He went to university. University is also dominated by female teachers and also has a predominance of female students now. He graduates from university and maybe he likes to watch sports and he puts on ESPN, and ESPN has female sportscasters. They're in locker rooms in many cases now as well. And you have the NBA, the WNBA, which is not nearly as enjoyable to watch as the NBA, being thrust upon him everywhere he goes. And so he sees being forced upon him female social norms everywhere, like literally everywhere for the entirety of his life for the past 26 years. And certainly there are other examples as well regarding speech. Then he sees Donald Trump, sort of try to stand up a little bit. And what happens is they try to kill him. And Donald Trump has never really harmed anybody. That's just another good example. And you see Kamala Harris, who accomplishes nothing throughout her career, who is then handed the presidential nomination because Joe Biden essentially like gives it to her. It's a signature example of being carried to almost the finish line. So this is what young men see. And meanwhile, they're trying to earn money. They're trying to build a living and build a family, which I think men are wired to do. And they find a lot of young women who say, yeah, I'm still finding myself. I'll throw out my 30s and I'll see you again when I'm 35 years old. And we can certainly talk about what a lot of young women do with their time in terms of their dating relationships as well. And so they see, and then we can even throw in diversity, equity, and inclusion measures as well. And so you see a young guy that suddenly feels very rightly, and then you have, again, sorry, just to add one more thing. Just like 3 or 4 days ago, Hillary Clinton went on, I think it was MSNBC, and saying like, straight white men of a particular religious persuasion are everything that's wrong with the country. Like that's Hillary Clinton saying this in 2025, right? So it was much louder in decades past. So you have young men that have essentially been told that, hey, this world is not for you. We don't want you. This is not like you're an alien, you're a stranger in someone else's land. Okay, fine. So then the things that the young man wants to enjoy for himself, he finds are declining in quality every single year. Meanwhile, inflation is driving down the purchasing power of his dollar. And really quality things are becoming less and less affordable. So he finds himself in every possible way slipping down a slide of uselessness, alienation. And into that space, you have a lot of guys, you naturally would understand why a young man would feel very angry. And they become very susceptible to older men that want to prey upon that anger for profit. And so that's a lot of what we're seeing. There is a real, genuine phenomenon to what young men are seeing and feeling. That's real, and it's been going on for a very long time. I don't mean to suggest otherwise. But we have too many voices who are talking about a negative, unbiblical response to it. Not enough voices saying this is what the biblical response has to be. And so I encourage the latter.
As I've been listening and even thinking about like some of the questions that we're asking and talking about, we've largely been talking about white men. Yep. I don't know that this conversation is tied only to white culture or the erasure of white men and white culture. Yeah. I actually think it's quite the opposite. I do think that there are a lot of Black men who also, grow up with single moms and things like that and have And I'm not talking about like the ghetto, culture that we see and this ratchetness and fights and all of that. I'm not talking about that. But for your Black man who is trying to figure out, how do I, do life? How do I, do work and dadness and, all of these things? A lot of what is being talked about here as being a white problem, this erasure of white culture. I would say Black men also feel like there's a erasure of Black culture, and it's being this co-opting by this ghetto culture of ratchetness and fights. And so a lot of what you're saying in Krista's question made me think of this. There's a guy named Kevin Samuels. Now, Kevin Samuels died a couple years ago, but Kevin Samuels would speak directly to Black men. And I didn't find him to be helpful always, but he spoke out against this idea of the masculine Black woman. And how have the roles really swapped, and why are we seeing this effeminate Black man, and why are Black men tired of this coddling, I guess, from a lot of Black women, from their mothers, and what does that prohibit in our culture? How do you become what he would call a high value man? And so what I want our audience to really understand is that this is not a white problem. We might have a majority of white people in our country. And so it is a lot easier at times to spot issues that are pertaining to white people. I can definitely acknowledge DEI can work toward or give off this feeling and sentiment of the erasure of, white people, white culture and things like that. But this is really a problem that men are facing. I would say when I speak to people who are Hispanic, they have a lot of the same complaints. And, this maneuvering through culture to try to understand, what does it mean to be a man and how do I man well? And so I just wanted to put that out there, because I do think that this conversation can take a turn or have a sound like this is only something impacting white people, and it's not. This is something that is impacting men across the board. Sadly, in our culture today, I would say, as you have mentioned, with the rise of the feminist movement, men have been pushed to the side. If you read Nancy Pearcey's book, Toxic Masculinity, it looks at some of these things. What happened to the family? What happened to the man? And all of these things. It is a man problem, not just a white man problem.
So glad you said that. Sorry, I didn't mean to cut you off.
Oh, no, go ahead. I'm done.
Okay. No, I'm so glad you said that, because I've done a series on my podcast with my good friend, Jonathan West, Black husband and father, lives in Tennessee. He's been the most frequent guest on my podcast, I think 6 or 7 appearances, and our series is called Race and the Renaissance. We talk literally about what you just said. This is not just a white man problem, that it's also a Black man problem. He lays it out in terms of, I think it's something like James and Tyrone, that there are two archetypes that Black men have to choose from. You can be, sort of the neutered, suburban, weak Black man, or you can be Tyrone, sort of the urban, kind of more aggressive, machismo, bravado, thug kind of guy. So he breaks it down along those lines. And so, it shows up there. And I'll do you one better. I think it even shows up in the Asian community.
Oh, yes.
You see, why are so many Asians adopting Black culture? Because I think they're looking for an image of the father that they're not finding in their own households as well. So this problem of fatherless, of father hunger, or father famine, as I call it, is across the spectrum. And I think young white men make a big mistake by saying it's just about us. It really, really isn't. It's a much larger civilizational crisis.
Yeah. I am really enjoying this conversation with Will Spencer, but I want to take a quick second to tell you about our book, Walking in Unity. We'll be right back.
As a white guy, you're saying, okay, I'm always perpetually guilty, but what has happened to be you're always perpetually the victim?
Either I can walk freely in my relationship with Christ, or I'm walking in bondage to another person's thoughts, ideas, and opinions.
From a biblical perspective, it's hard to argue that people who were not slaves deserve payment from people who were not slave owners.
Yeah, it's funny when that question gets presented to churches be multi-ethnic. I've never seen African-American churches wrestle with that.
See, here we go.
Here we go. I think when you have multi-ethnic children and when you have an adoption by a family that's not the same ethnicity, really what you have to do is prep them for adversity, but we have to do that anyway.
we're all here today to talk about is walking in our unity in Christ. You know, Christ supremacy, not white supremacy, right? That's what we're talking about.
That's a good one right there. I think this is a moment for true Christians to actually shine.
Just so you know, Walking in Unity, the book, also has a curriculum component alongside. You can go to centerforbiblicalunity.com to find out more information on our book, Walking in Unity, and on our small group curriculum.
For the parents, because most of the people that listen to this podcast are parents, they're leaders, they're pastors, they're teachers in Christian schools. What would be some of your suggestions about how we begin to talk to our young men about these issues? Maybe those that are starting to fall into this mindset. What kind of interventions do we need to provide, or what kind of conversations do we need to be having?
Yeah, so this can work on the collective level for a church or a community, and in the family level and the individual level. So you're going at levels of resolution. So there's the whole church, there's this family that an individual man is a part of or comes from, and then the individual man himself. I really love a video that Doug Wilson put out yesterday, sort of about some of the changes that we all need to make as a result of this cultural moment. And he highlighted two things that I think are really important if we want to chart the way forward. Every church and pastor and leader has to do away with any belief in Darwinism, which has caused nothing but pain and suffering and destruction to the West since it was, birthed in the mid 19th century. And I've done a lot of content about that on my website. Mm-hmm. The devastation that Darwinism, that evolution has led to is unquestionable.
Yeah.
And so first is we have to do away with Darwinism, and second is we have to do away with feminism. Any feminist beliefs. And a lot of people do believe that first wave feminism was legitimate. In fact, that is not the case. There were many women during the first wave movement that were deeply opposed to feminism, and a lot of the first wave feminists were themselves occultists. And you can read about this in the book, The End of Women by Carrie Gress. And you can also read about that in Occult Feminism by Rachel Wilson. And then there's the book about the sexual evolution by Louise Perry. She actually became a Christian because she recognized that all of the social problems of the sexual revolution were actually warned about by Christianity. So she recently announced that she became a Christian. That was a great thing. So I think a lot of women are beginning to recognize, hey, like feminism wasn't a good idea from the very start. So from a church cultural level, though it will be very difficult, I don't mean to underplay the difficulty, you do have to do away with Darwinism and feminism. And those two will be very big steps for a church culture. If you want to begin addressing a man at the individual level, the question that I always begin with all the men that I counsel is, what was your relationship like with your father growing up? Was he around? Was he present? Were your parents married? That question, and the same goes for women, but that question reveals a lot. Yeah, my dad was around, but he was very passive, or he was very checked out, or he was abusive, or he was absent. Absent, abdicating, and abusive fathers are just three categories of bad father. And so by understanding what a young man's relationship was like with his father in the household growing up, you can learn a lot about him. That's not to say that things are deterministic. We all make choices, but to understand whether that gap exists in his heart and how he's chosen to fill it, what influences. Is it Christ or is it something else? And so that answers that question, can answer it very, very powerfully. And then I think the third is pastors and leaders have to be prepared to pour into the lives of young men who haven't had fathers. I think the same is true for young women, but that's different conversation. Right. Have to really be prepared to pour into young men and to challenge them and to not be afraid to do so. You may end up spending far more time shepherding the flock of young men that you have than you've done anything else, sermon prep or anything else. Very well, and that I'm very blessed to be in a church where the pastor cares very much about shepherding the flock, a very modest man, who lives a very modest life, and he pours into his people, and he made an impact in my life. And I think pastors, if they truly care about addressing the situation, need to be prepared to do the same. But the way that we do that is ultimately we have to be prepared to look very seriously at the fifth commandment, honor thy mother and father. And no matter who your mother was or who your father was, we as their children have to be prepared to honor them and to forgive them, and also to recognize our own judgments of them. We are called not to carry judgments of our parents. That is the root to so much destruction in our own lives, believing my dad didn't love me or my mom didn't love me or X, Y, and Z. We carry those roots of bitterness, and they truly warp our life. We sow seeds, and then we sow the wind and we reap the whirlwind in ways we can't predict, because the fifth commandment says that will happen. And so the really challenging thing that I think a lot of pastors, faith leaders, and counselors will have to do is dig into the relationship that young men have with both their parents, their mother and their father, and really put young men into a place of forgiveness and a place of repentance for their own bitterness towards their parents. Extraordinarily difficult, especially because we live in a culture that highlights childhood trauma as the source of all of our problems. That all you have to do is blame all of your childhood problems on your parents. That is anti-biblical, anti-Christian. We are called to forgive our parents. We're called to honor our parents, no matter who they are. That doesn't mean we have to have a relationship with them if they're not good people, but we are still called to honor them, and we're still called to repent of our judgments of them. And that way lies true freedom. And I'm grateful to say that's the direction that I was led early in my faith walk, and has paid massive dividends. In fact, I had dinner with my dad, and I apologized to him. My dad is not a believer. I apologized to him, and I said, I'm sorry for the judgments that I carried of you. He said, you don't have to say that to me. I said, I know that you don't want me to. Like, it's not something you're asking for. It's something my faith calls me to do. Dad, I'm sorry. Mm-hmm. And that is very, very difficult. It runs deeply countercultural to our psychologized culture. But that way lies true freedom. So hopefully those are some guides at different levels of resolution for how we can work in young men's hearts.
That was really helpful.
Yeah, that's powerful. I'm thinking too, just the men who hear this podcast. I know that many of our the women who follow our podcast do share it sometimes with their husbands when there's more masculine topics that we're talking about. But I'm imagining that Christian men are going to have to figure out some ways, and our pastors are going to have to figure out some ways to build culture. It sounds like is what you're saying, that young men need a calling, they need a purpose. Having your dad say, come on, don't be lazy, stop playing your Xbox, might not be the most helpful response when they notice that there's a problem, but maybe the father inviting the son, hey, come outside and help me fix the washing machine, or come with me to the hardware store. We're going to work on this project together, so that there is a level of side by side that men need to do. Or maybe a man in a church that has a hobby and his sons are grown, but he wants to invest in the younger men in his church, even if it was inviting young men over to his house to work on projects or to go play golf or something. That this is the kind of vision that we need for our Christian men to have. That's kind of embedded what I hear you saying.
Yeah. I got asked this question a couple days ago, and I think Christian churches about how to lead men's groups. And I think Christian churches that I'm aware of easily fall into one of two ditches. Now, there's nothing wrong with either of these things as such, but they're incomplete answers in themselves. I'm part of the Reformed tradition. A lot of our men's groups, we get together, we talk about, writings of church fathers or doctrine or parts of scripture. We really begin unpacking from an intellectual sense the things that we're reading to understand doctrine better. That's fantastic, very needed. Definitely do it. On the other side, there's a ditch there. On the other side, I think a lot of churches now, particularly a lot of men's groups, are getting into men's emotional states. Like, I feel guilt, I feel shame, repentance from sin. These are the things I'm struggling with. More emotional vulnerability. Also very important. Definitely do it. But again, both of those, they're incomplete without each other. But there's a third component that men need, which is activity. Men need to get out and go do something. In fact, I would even say they need to do something first. I hosted a men's retreat here in Phoenix back in October. And we went to bed early on Friday. The men arrived on Friday. We had some dinner, went to bed early. And then we got up and we did physical activity all Saturday morning, including like a good run and a workout, and then some tactical stuff, just related to household protection. And it was all physical. And then that opened the doorway for a discussion of doctrine that I led later on, and then more like personal stuff that came later that night around the fire. And that pattern of physical activity, let the men get to know each other in physical context first, and then you get into doctrine, and then how does this apply to our lives? That creates a more complete picture for how to build a men's group. That takes effort, but that's the same for fathers and sons. It's exactly the same. It's like, don't just tell your son to get off the Xbox and read a book. Like, yeah, of course, that's great, but go take your son to work on something. If you don't know how to work on something, learn it with him. And in the process of doing that, then you can talk about life stuff, whether it be with your son or with your friend. That's how men are. They'll go on a fishing trip. Two guys will go on a fishing trip. They will sit in absolute silence next to each other for like 4 hours. They won't say a word. And then after 6 hours, they'll start talking. But they've already been conversing that entire time just without words, which I think a lot of men will understand. So you can't, when you're doing work with men, you can't go only to the emotional or only to the doctrinal. You have to go to the physical and let them do stuff. It can be a hike, it can be a game, like some sort of sporting event. It's difficult because men of different ages, have different physical capabilities. So it can sometimes be difficult to balance things out, but certainly it's worth it, the effort. And for our individual relationships, get out and do stuff. Turn off the screen, get out of the living room, go for a walk in the snow or go for a hike in the sun, and let that set the stage for everything that'll come later for discussion.
I love that. One of the things that I wanted to just say in addition to that, or maybe a reminder to some men, is that not every boy has a dad. And if your son is in relationship with someone, a boy who doesn't have a dad, and you are a dad, maybe invite that son along. If you're in a church and you know that there are boys who do not have fathers, speak up, speak into their life, like be present, because your presence will go very far in their lives. It is not just a thing, of, well, sorry for little Timmy, he ain't got no daddy. You know what I mean? Like, how do we open up our hearts, our homes, our emotions and thoughts, and all that you're saying, so that we can create a space where Andrew Tate isn't needed.
Yeah.
Because we have that here within the body of Christ, and we are raising our young men, or men, I don't want to include myself in that, like men are speaking into young men and raising young men to be godly, righteous young men, rather than the opposite, being distant. And now young men feel like they need to go to the Andrew Tate or to the Kevin Samuels of the world.
Yeah. I mean, the real challenge is Andrew Tate will always be seductive. He will always be seductive because he has lots of money, he has muscles, and he's got girls. That will always be seductive. He's brash, he's bold, he's outspoken, he seems to be very self-assured. Like, he has all the flashy outer stuff that plays really well in the media and on screens. He looks the part. Who knows who he is when behind closed doors, but certainly he looks the part, and that will always be seductive. I mean, you can just read Proverbs and you can hear King Solomon pleading with his son not to walk in the paths of the violent and the wicked men. Like that's like Proverbs 1, right? And so that seduction will always be there. I think the solution, is to warn what that is, to paint a picture of what that actually looks like behind the scenes. And of course, there's, footage of Andrew Tate being quite a violent man to a woman that's out there. And so you can see, like, hey, this is who this guy is behind the scenes, right? So there's that, and you can highlight many of the things that he says as well. But I think the trick instead is to just fill up the space with so much togetherness that there's no room for Andrew Tate to come in. Certainly warn against him, but if men feel like they're part of something that's healthy and that's working, and that they see older men, whether it be elders or fathers, like middle-aged fathers, actively engage with them, repenting, being honest, not pretending like they have it all together, or not being like sad sack weak sops either, but just being genuinely real, that there's no space for someone like an Andrew Tate to come in. And look, I understand that this is a gigantic ask. I am under no illusions about how big of an effort and significant that this is. What I'm asking of pastors and elders and men and fathers inside churches, I know. And yet this is wartime in a way, and this is the war. We are in a war for the souls of young men. This is the moment that in 50 years, who knows, we might not be here. 100 years, we'll be dealing with something else. But right now, we are in a war for the souls of young men. And we need to look at that for what it is and take that responsibility on gratefully and understand this is the first time in history that something like this has probably happened. I think if you were to wind back the clock 1,000 years, you wouldn't be able to find too many books about what it means to be a man because it was just in the air, it's just in the water. But if you look up books on masculinity on Amazon, you can find stacks and stacks and stacks of them, retreats and organizations, all trying to answer this problem. I don't think this has happened at another time in human history. And so there's a way in which we can look at this as a unique opportunity to create something anew if we submit to what God's will for the moment is and not wish that it was something else.
Well, thank you so much for having this conversation with us, Will. This has been interesting, insightful, helpful. I know we're going to get a lot of feedback about this show. It's going to be great. So,
well, praise God.
Yeah. Thank you so much for coming.
Thank you.
My pleasure. Thank you for having me.
Wow, what an awesome conversation.
It's very powerful. There's a lot to digest there.
There is. I mean, there's a lot. I think what I'm hoping people will walk away with more than anything is that these topics and everything that Will said is not applicable just to one segment of man. It is something that all men are walking through. They may walk through it with a twinge of cultural difference, but they are definitely walking through it.
Yeah, he gave me so many things to think about. I'm definitely going to have to go back and rewatch this conversation because there was a lot to absorb. We're going to have links to a couple of Will's articles in the description, and you can go follow his podcast as well if you want more information about him and his ministry. So thanks, everyone, for being on this journey with us. Next week, Monique is spearheading a conversation with our friend Dr. Jeff Degner. It's our favorite economist. What are you guys up to?
We're going to talk about inflation and asking the question of does inflation de-incentivize family? And what are, some of the ramifications of such high rates of inflation? There was a study that came out earlier this year that it has reached the lowest birth rate in history. And so we need to talk about, what are some of those reasons and how are inflation rates impacting even Christian families? Christians have our creation mandate to go forth, to multiply, to fill the earth and all of that. And so are we doing that, or are we also, really impacted by inflation and feeling that and feeling like abiding within the creation mandate and God's words in Genesis don't really fit right now?
Yeah. Feeling like the so-called American dream is a little bit out of reach, I think.
Girl, right now it feels like a nightmare. I am sure many people feel like this is just a nightmare. Like, what in the world are we doing? But then we'll also look at, there's a very strong possibility that Zoran Mamdani, the Muslim democratic socialist in New York, may be winning the mayoral candidate in New York City. Is inflation part of the reason why people would vote for him?
Yeah.
There's a lot to talk about regarding inflation. So we're going to do that next week.
Very good. And we are inching our way to the end of the season. So it's been a good year, but 2025 hasn't exactly gone the way that I was expecting it
None
to.
of this was on my bingo card. Nothing. My bingo card is just blank. I was like, I didn't see that one. Didn't have that. Yeah. It's just there.
Well, thank you so much for watching. Make sure to share this with a friend. We really appreciate all of your support and all that you do to pray for us and help spread the message that we work on so diligently here at the Center for Biblical Unity. We will see you next week.
There's nothing left.